Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise tonight to speak to Bill C-11, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act. Of course, Bill C-11 seeks to modernize the existing Broadcasting Act for the first time since 1991, primarily to bring online streaming services like Netflix and YouTube within its domain. In my view, well, it's been a long time. C-11 is certainly needed. We need to modernize the Broadcasting Act. I also feel it's well-intentioned legislation on behalf of the governing party, and it has good items in it. I'll mention a few. One, of course, is a requirement for streaming services like Netflix to invest more in Canadian productions. Secondly, that it legitimizes the role of community broadcasting. This includes nonprofit and campus radio stations, acknowledging that community broadcasters, through collaboration with local organizations and community members, are in a unique position to be able to provide varied programming to meet the needs of their communities. That being said, Bill C-11 also has significant issues. First, that in it we see all throughout vague language, some contradictions. At times it's fairly poorly written. I'll give you one example. In a section I'll be talking about next, there's a definition of social media service without that term actually being defined earlier in the bill. Of course, as we've heard from others, it skips over a really critical opportunity to update and clarify the definition of what is Canadian content. And most importantly of all, that despite claims that only platforms would be regulated, there are very clear provisions in the bill that allow for user-generated content to be regulated, and the chair of the CRTC confirmed as much when he was in front of the Heritage Committee. One of those provisions is any time that user-generated content generates either direct or indirect revenue. What does that mean? Well, I think about a local musician who might be soliciting financial contributions on a YouTube live stream, for example, and whether that musician might fall under the regulations that are permitted under this act. Now, I want to be really clear. There are some who have said that this bill censors what Canadians would be allowed to watch. That's simply not true. That is not in this legislation. That said, both at committee and in the wider conversation across the country on this bill, nonpartisan experts and those affected by the legislation have shared their concerns. I'd like to share a few of those with you, Madam Speaker, this evening. One is YouTube content creators themselves, Canadians like Morgan Faultier. Morgan said this: Bill C-11 is not an ill-intentioned piece of legislation, but it's a bad piece of legislation. It's been written by those who don't understand the industry they're attempting to regulate. Many more others are on the record with their concerns similar to Morgan, other YouTube content creators across the country. Then, of course, there are also subject matter experts like Michael Geist, who've sounded the alarm. Now, he's written often on the topic. Of course, he spoke at committee. I hesitate to even bring up Mr. Geist, given how often he's already been referenced in this debate over the last number of weeks. I'll just quote him briefly, one snippet that I think is important for this House to hear again, that Bill C-11 needs, in quotes, extensive review and further reform to get it right. Finally, political analyst Erica Ifill shared her many concerns in a recent Hill Times article. She put it succinctly: the new broadcasting bill still does not address core problems of the digital experience. For my part, recognizing some of these issues, I brought two amendments to committee. One would have removed the various sections.
You're sharing your time with me.
I will pause here for a moment to let Madam Speaker know I'll be sharing my time with the member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, for my part, I brought two amendments to the committee. One would have removed every section in 4.2 of the bill that allowed for user-generated content to be regulated at all. To say, okay, there are various provisions here that open up that opportunity. Why not close those? To be really clear that platforms are in and users are out. The second was more precise but less ambitious. To say, okay, let's just remove those users who generate indirect revenue. Can we not at least agree on that? That that's a group of users that this likely wasn't intended for, so let's take that out. Again, parliamentarians, I think from all parties, have previously said they believe in this premise of platforms in, users out. And so, yeah, I was disappointed that both these amendments were defeated at committee. I'd also like to briefly note my disappointment in the process. It wasn't the best moment that, we saw the animosity between committee members, between opposing parties in this chamber, and that resulted in the majority of votes on amendments last Tuesday night had to take place without any debate at all. I think, in my time here, I've seen better moments. I can think of back in December where members came together to unanimously move forward on banning conversion therapy, for example. There have been incredible moments in this place of parliamentarians working together. In my view, that was one of our less strong moments as parliamentarians. To summarize then, in my view, when assessing legislation, I find myself thinking about my neighbors in Kitchener. And for our community, I ask myself, does this bill do more harm than good? And I get it. Rarely will I get to vote on legislation that fully addresses the interests of my community. So my sense is I'll always support legislation that has a net positive impact. My concern with C-11 is that it could do more harm than good. This is the reason I didn't support it earlier this afternoon, and I'm not likely to support it at third reading tomorrow. I appreciate the good intentions. I appreciate that there are good elements in the bill. I certainly wish we had more time to debate it and even to see more negotiation amongst parliamentarians to see amendments tabled and moved forward with. And assuming it'll soon be moving to the Senate, I hope they take the opportunity to improve the bill. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member at the beginning of his speech made reference to the fact that we have not modernized the legislation for many years. And when we take a look overall, I believe that you'll get a consensus from the stakeholders that this is, in fact, a step forward for an important industry, let alone artists and creators and all those involved.
The Honourable Member for, Pembroke, no, not Pembroke, Renfrew-Nipissing Pembroke.
Madam Speaker, I don't believe we have quorum.
Quorum calls after 6:30. There's a judgment.
We don't have quorum, but we also, Madam Speaker, are without constitutional requirement of quorum. In other words, the NDP House leadership, we want them to confirm that they did not agree to the government's unconstitutional extension of outer.
The Honourable Member is out of order, and I would ask the Honourable Member to stop.
No. What's out of order is the fact that we're.
Yeah, it's here. Yeah. The Honourable.
Point of order while I'm still doing my point of order.
No, the Honourable Member doesn't have the floor. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, but the Honourable Member for Renfrew-Nipissing Pembroke, as far as I was paying close attention, was not given the floor at any time by the Speaker. No one who's not been given the floor by the Speaker is allowed to speak. And once the Speaker stands, everyone is to sit down.
Well, I did mention the Honourable Member. I gave her the floor, but as soon as I saw where it was going, I got up again. So there is no reason for a point of order. Those items have been debated more than once, and the Speaker has ruled.
The Constitution requires to sit. So now
the Speaker has made a ruling. It can be found on the debates of May 2nd, 2022 at pages 4577 and 4578. I would invite the member to read the ruling of the Speaker to find that this matter has already been settled. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And the point that I was getting to is the member, I'm sure, is aware of the importance of modernizing the Act, and a vast majority of the stakeholders see the legislation as a step forward. So for the broader community, being of Canada, artists, creators, the workers in that industry, they see it as positive legislation. And I'm wondering if he can just reflect on that aspect.
For Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to make clear with the parliamentary, through you to the parliamentary secretary, of course, that I do agree with him. As I said in my speech, this has been quite some time since the Broadcast Act was first passed, that there is an important need to modernize the Act, and I'm glad the governing party prioritized that. I also believe it's important to get it right. And while there are many stakeholders, as he's mentioned, who are supportive, there are also many others, some of which I mentioned, YouTube content creators, Canadian YouTube content creators, who are quite concerned. And so I go back again. Yes, it is a difficult decision not to support this legislation, but the analysis I'm doing, again, is weighing harm versus good. And my concern is here that with this legislation, as currently written, given some of the vague language and allowing for user-generated content to be regulated as it does, that it opens the possibility to more harm than good.
Honourable Member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member from Kitchener Centre for his comments. And it's one of those rare occasions, and perhaps not so rare, where the Blues and the Greens are on the same page on something, and it's on 4.2. And he mentioned in his comments about the ambitious versus less ambitious amendment. I want to talk about the less ambitious amendment taking out indirect revenue and the impact that would have in at least ensuring that those who are paid by the platforms would be captured, but those who have indirect revenue, indirect through licensing deals, through sponsorships, weren't captured. So I wonder if he could expand on that and how that would have been a small change, but would have had a big impact on digital-first creators and how they do their work.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Yeah, I do think it's important. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the member for Perth Wellington for the question. I think it's important to offer multiple options, and that was my intention, to say, here is a concern I've identified, I had the chance to speak to it, and offered a few ways where the committee could consider addressing, and I know other parliamentarians did as well. In my view, at least taking out user-generated content with indirect revenue would have been a reasonable amendment. And it's also my view that had we had less of the rhetoric in this place and more of a collaborative engagement between parliamentarians across party lines, that there would have been an opportunity to say, you know what, this is a reasonable one, we can agree on this piece, we'll put aside our differences over here. My sense is with this particular legislation at this time of year, that it didn't allow for some of those improvements that I believe all of us should be reflecting on, the reasons why those reasonable improvements didn't see the light of day.